Now, let's start with the before lecture chant. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, everybody. Last week, we started our discussion of the Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path, and we discussed the first and second of the 8 elements: right view and right thinking. And just as a reminder, right view is actually our ability to recognize that which is wholesome and that which is beneficial, and to water and nurture that, and also to bring awareness to what is unwholesome and to not necessarily water and nurture that. And the foundation of right view is that our views are made up of perceptions, our subjective way of seeing things, including our biases, our preferences, our prejudices, and our judgments. And Thich Nhat Hanh reminded us to look closely at our perceptions and really make an effort to understand their source. And by looking deeply at them, we actually can free their hold on us. And they have the capability to rather become insightful or helpful, or even become a realization, seeing things as they are. And we water wholesome seeds through our mindfulness of breath, walking, eating, living in the present moment. And an important and natural progression from right view is right thinking or right intention, which reflects the way things really are. Practicing right view and right thinking puts us here in this moment. And it's here where Thich Nhat Hanh says we can touch these seeds that are within us and transform our suffering and the suffering of others. The third chapter about the Noble Eightfold Path in our book is right mindfulness, which is actually number 7 in the circle on the wheel. And it actually represents, putting it here, it represents a bit of a departure from the normal ordering. But Thich Nhat Hanh writes that he switched it this way because of the importance of right mindfulness, which he calls the very energy that brings us into the present moment. When we are mindful, our thinking is right thinking, our speech is right speech, and so on. Our mindful practice, as we all know, is not something we just practice on the cushion, but rather every moment of every day. At least that's our intention. And Thich Nhat Hanh encourages us to be alive and present to all wonders of life that present themselves to us. So mindfulness naturally leads to and includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th elements of the Eightfold Path on the wheel. But I've chosen today to forego a lengthier discussion of mindfulness in favor of addressing these 3 elements, which are often linked together as ethical conduct. And next week, we'll take a look at right mindfulness in a discussion of the 3 elements of meditation, which would also include right diligence and right concentration. But in these chapters of ethical conduct, Thich Nhat Hanh references what he calls the 5 mindfulness trainings, which are his representation of what we might know as the original 5 precepts that were developed during the time of the Buddha. And they became the foundation of practice for the entire practice lay community during Buddha's time. And you'll recognize these. The first training is to protect life, to not kill, and to decrease violence in oneself, in one's family, and in society. The second training of his is to practice social justice, which he calls generosity. So we know that maybe is not stealing or not exploiting other living beings. The third is the practice of responsible sexual behavior in order to protect individuals, couples, families, and children, society in general. The fourth, practice of deep listening and loving speech to restore communication and reconcile. So what we're going to talk about today, right speech. And the fifth is about mindful consumption to help us not bring toxins and poisons into our body or mind. So we have these precepts: refrain from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying or wrong speech, and using intoxicants. And it's easy to see that the fourth mindfulness training is an expression of right speech, deep listening and loving speech. And it's certainly a training and a precept that we can all acknowledge we could really use in our world today. A world that actually has an incredible array of sophisticated methods of communicating with each other, but in which it seems as individuals, we really struggle to communicate and to be understood. And traditionally, right speech emphasized, so in the traditional teachings, right speech emphasized that we speak truthfully, that we don't speak with a forked tongue. We don't hear that very often anymore, but telling one person one thing and another person another thing. That we don't speak cruelly towards each other, and cruelly includes even shouting or any kind of speech that creates suffering or hatred. And lastly, that we do not exaggerate or embellish. And we all know this takes effort, for it really is suggesting that we can change our habits so that our speech arises from bodhicitta, from our Buddha heart and mind, and not from something we discussed last week, was our unresolved, unwholesome seeds. And it requires our diligence at right thinking and mindfulness. So we enter into conversation, any conversation, in a mindful and compassionate way. And Thich Nhat Hanh puts a great emphasis on deep listening, calling it the very foundation of right speech. And I really like this quote and hope I can actually remember at least the essence of it. He says, quote, "I am listening in response to another person. I am listening to him, not only because I want to know what is inside him or to give him advice. I'm listening to him just because I want to relieve his suffering." Compassionate listening. And our practice with our breath, bringing us back to the present moment, allows us to stay there, even if we feel anger or frustration or boredom in relation to another person or people, or even as our mind wanders off. We can remember to say, "Where are my feet?" to bring us back, or just simply return to our breath for a few moments until we've settled back into deep listening, deep open listening. But if we find ourselves unable to really listen, then perhaps we are best to say, "You know, I can't do this right now. Could we have this conversation at another time?" So just being honest about it. And of course, we must bring the same kind of mindfulness to our speaking. You know, I grew up hearing things like, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Is that familiar to anyone else? And there is some of that here. You know, even if we're telling the truth, if it creates bad feelings in others, it's not right speech. We have to have the intention to even present our ideas in a way that others can accept it in order for it to be right, for it to be loving. And Thich Nhat Hanh includes in the discussion of right speech what we actually write. So it reminds us to consider the content of lyrics, for example, and movies and TV shows, etc., what we daily ingest. Back in around 2008 or 2009, I was practicing with a Fresno group, with Linda actually, in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition. And I bought their, I think it was called their chant book, but it had some real wisdom. It had the precepts in it, I remember, and had various other things. And that was the first time I read about Thich Nhat Hanh's telephone meditations. And he relates a few of those in the book. But I really loved this one. And I started using it as soon as I read about it. So he's saying, when the phone rings, take 3 slow breaths before answering. And let our mind clear so that when we answer the phone, we're answering it with attention and intention. And I started doing that, and it really works. It really allows me to be more present in a phone conversation. And he has a few others you can refer back to the book. But lastly, let's not forget that our practice is actually helping us to rely less on words and more on silence, letting the essence of the moment actually rise and giving us the opportunity to also look deeply. And next along the circle of the Eightfold Path, after right speech, is right action, the second ethical conduct. And this is basically related to the fact that everything we do with our body is done in mindfulness. And whereas Thich Nhat Hanh closely associated right speech with the 4th mindfulness training, or our 4th precept, don't lie, here we clearly see the other 4 trainings. First, committing ourselves to compassion and cultivating ways to preserve all life. And to understand that even though we may not kill by our own hand voluntarily, we are involved in the killing of life, whether it's our leather shoes or going outside and stepping on an insect we didn't really see. The second is related to generosity. Not stealing is the traditional way of saying that. Generosity of our time, our resources, our energy toward the well-being of others. And it's a vow to not take from others that which is not ours, to not exploit other people. And the third is about sexual responsibility. That is, it is a commitment to protect and nurture the safety and integrity of others. It's a vow to behave responsibly and to encourage others to do so also. The 5th training relates to the discussion we had last week, mindful consumption and taking care of what we ingest and why. But he reminds us that this is not just a personal commitment. When we consume wisely, for example, we're protecting and nurturing not only our body and our consciousness, he says, but also that of our family and society in general. In fact, he writes that he sees mindful consumption as the only way out of our current destruction of the collective body and consciousness of society. So he ends this chapter by showing the many things we can do to practice right action, to protect life, to practice generosity, to behave responsibly and consume mindfully. And you know, these words ring so familiar to me growing up. Watch out, don't step on that beetle. Share with your sister. Don't be mean. Don't take more food than you need. These are messages I heard while I was growing up, over and over again. Right action, based in right mindfulness. And we've actually known this and heard this all along. So right action is, of course, closely linked to right livelihood, the 3rd element of the grouping of ethical conduct. And I learned here in reading his book that the Buddhist sutras, the records of the Buddha's teachings, usually define right livelihood as earning a living without needing to transgress any of the 5 mindfulness trainings or the 5 precepts. And he delineates these as not dealing in arms, in the slave trade, the meat trade, the sale of alcohol, drugs, or poisons, or making prophecies or telling fortunes. So they're a bit more quaint than how we look at them today. And right livelihood, then, in the broader sense, dictates that we have a vocation or an occupation that is beneficial to all living things on earth, or at least to do as little harm as possible. Practicing right livelihood requires us to look closely at how we earn our living, even if we're not earning one, how we are doing our living, and discern what consequences, if any, there may be in our lives and beyond. It does present a lot of dilemmas, for sure. Thich Nhat Hanh uses the example of farmers. Without certain chemicals, their crops may suffer and they may not be competitive on the market. A cattleman might have inherited his ranch and his cattle, and he's committed for his life to continuing the family tradition. The son of a butcher may have felt he had no choice but to help his father, and he felt great pressure by his family to continue to support them in this way. But there was an ethical dilemma. So can they be resolved, these dilemmas? Well, Thich Nhat Hanh suggests that if there is intention to look deeply at one's livelihood and one's life, and there is the intention to practice mindfulness wholeheartedly, then, as one's insight deepens, the way out of the situation will eventually present itself. It may take time. It actually may never happen. But the effort to practice mindfulness should, he says, permeate all aspects of our lives. And as we know, this is not only an issue of how we earn our living. But he makes this poignant observation. He says, we cannot succeed at having a right livelihood 100%. But we can resolve to go in the direction of compassion and reducing suffering. And we can resolve to help create a society in which there is more right livelihood and less wrong livelihood, end quote. So in my opinion, the farmer could devote part of his land to organic farming, as my cousin did. The cattleman can commit to maintaining humane conditions to the best of his ability for his herd. And the butcher can purchase his stock from this humane cattleman. And of course, most of us are not farmers, I think, or cattlemen or butchers. But whatever our professions or avocations, we can have intention toward right livelihood. Now, I was an English as a second language and linguistics teacher, instructor at Fresno City College for many years, many decades. And it seems on the face of it that teaching can certainly be in accordance with the five mindfulness trainings and right livelihood. But of course, there's plenty of opportunity to do harm. And when I was putting this talk together, the thought of a particular student arose. And this was a student in my ESL class probably 20 to 25 years ago. And this young man was a gang member who, although enrolled in my class, was, often absent, didn't do much of the work at all. And when he was there, he was a bit irreverent. He had quite the bravado in relation to other students and machismo. He had good armor. He learned to have good armor. And it's odd now, but I can't really remember why on this particular day I was irritated with him, but I was. And one day, after he had missed almost 2 weeks of class, he bounded into the hallway from our classroom as I was approaching the door, and he looked right at me. And his entire face was smiling. And he said, "Hey, Miss Van Vliet, you see, I'm back." And I wish I had had the wisdom of the backward step at that moment, but I didn't. I wish I'd had the presence to just let that moment become what he wanted it to be, or what he needed it to be. Instead, I looked at him and I basically dismissed him. And I have no idea right now what I said. But I remember, and I remember this kind of often, in my entire body, the change that took place on his face. And then and now, I really think I can't begin to understand all that he was feeling at that moment, having lived the hard life that he had lived, trying to get out of that life. But I had the opportunity to hear him. I had the opportunity to meet him heart to heart and to do no harm. And I didn't do any of that. I did not go in the direction of compassion and reducing suffering. I just created more suffering in one split second. And so as we look at our lives and what we say and how we say it, and what we do and how we do it, and how we live, whether this is paid or not, we're earning something or not, we can assume that we are always in a position where we may cause harm. There are always consequences to be had. But let us be firmly grounded in our commitments to right mindfulness, out of which right speech, right action, and right livelihood are all possible. And let us at least have the intention to do as little harm as possible. We'll take a few moments for reflection, at the end of which Marty will sound one bell.